In 2022, Singapore's GDP per capita at purchasing power parity PPP reached an astonishing $128,000, ranking second globally, just behind Luxembourg. Hey, can you imagine? Just 60 years ago, Singapore was riddled with slums, plagued by severe racial conflict, and constantly disrupted by strikes. Its GDP per capita was less than 1/100th of what it is today. Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew, truly navigated this like playing a video game, leveling up and conquering challenges all the way. And his methods, they were incredibly unorthodox. Whatever conventional economic theory deemed unreasonable, well, that's precisely what he did. And the magic of it, he kept going all in and kept winning, transforming this fractured nation into one of the wealthiest in the world. Alright, enough preamble. Let's dive into the story of this incredible little nation, Singapore. Oh, and a quick disclaimer, I know many of you might be more interested in Singapore's politics. However, sticking to my usual style, I'll focus on the economic aspects, which I'm more familiar with. But please, feel free to share any thoughts you have in the comments section. The Malay annals record that in the 11th century, a Southeast Asian prince, en route to the Strait of Malacca, landed on an island at its southern tip. Upon disembarking, he encountered a marvelous beast he'd never seen before. Startled, he asked his attendant, "Do you know what this creature is?" The attendant informed the prince that this magnificent animal was a lion. The prince, awestruck, declared, "Wow, amazing. Let's call this land Lion City. In Sanskrit, that's Singapura." And yes, that name evolved into Singapore. So, Singapore has deep ties to the lion. Even today, their national symbol is the merlion. Singapore is, by all accounts, tiny. Its land area is only 728 square kilometers, roughly a quarter the size of Hong Kong. If you were to drive from one end to the other without traffic, you'd be across it in about 40 minutes. Small as it is, its geographical location is incredibly important. As the southernmost point of the Strait of Malacca, it's a vital crossroads connecting India and China. Historically, this led to it being ruled by various maritime powers like Portugal and the Netherlands. In 1819, Stamford Raffles of the British East India Company landed in Singapore, marking the beginning of British colonial rule. The place had virtually no natural resources and a small population, unlike its neighbors India, China, or even Malaysia and Indonesia. For its rulers, there wasn't much to exploit. So, even after Britain claimed Singapore, they harbored no grand designs for it, instead choosing to establish it as a zero-tariff free port. This single move immediately invigorated the small island's economy, though perhaps it fostered an environment that was a bit too free, with various grey industries like gambling, the slave trade, and prostitution flourishing. Regardless, by 1900, Singapore had become one of the busiest ports globally, home to about 200,000 people. But the good times didn't last. After the turmoil of two world wars, especially during the Pacific War in 1940 to when Japan occupied British-held Singapore for over 3 years, the island was a ruin when it returned to British hands. Temporary slums were everywhere. By then, Singaporeans were beginning to awaken to a new consciousness. We've been ruled by various powers for so long, this cannot continue. We must stand up for ourselves. Simultaneously, post-World War II Britain's control over most of its global colonies, including Singapore, had significantly weakened. Various political parties emerged in Singapore opposing British rule. Independence was an inevitable tide. If we view Singapore's national development as a gripping drama, by this point, the emotional and environmental stage was perfectly set. The time and place were ripe. All that was missing was the protagonist. A hero, like a knight in shining armor, was needed to descend from the heavens and lead Singapore's meteoric rise. We now know this knight was Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew was born in 1923 into a relatively affluent Singaporean family. He received a quality education from a young age, studying at the London School of Economics and later pursuing law at Cambridge University. In 1950, at the age of 27, Lee returned to Singapore and became a lawyer. Fluent in English, Mandarin, and Malay, his time in Britain gradually nurtured his anti-colonial sentiments. In 1954, along with a group of intellectuals who had also returned from Britain, he co-founded the People's Action Party (PAP). Just from his resume, you can tell he was incredibly intelligent. Moreover, he was a gifted orator with immense personal charisma. After several years of navigating complex political landscapes involving various Singaporean parties, the Malayan Communist Party, the British, and even factions within the PAP, Lee Kuan Yew emerged victorious in Singapore's first self-government elections in 1959, becoming Prime Minister. The PAP has remained Singapore's ruling party to this day, but don't think Singapore's ascent began immediately. Not at all. Just as Singapore achieved self-government and Lee Kuan Yew took the helm as Prime Minister, a major blow struck. Initially, Lee felt Singapore was too small to survive on its own, especially without the protective umbrella of the British. He believed the best path forward was to merge with Malaya to the north. And so, in 1963, Singapore, along with the Federation of Malaya and other territories, formed Malaysia. You'd expect a honeymoon period for a newly formed federation, right? But unexpectedly, disagreements quickly surfaced. Economically, Singapore was required to contribute 40% of its revenue to the central government, a stipulation that irked many Singaporeans. But the more severe conflict was rooted in race. The Malaysian Federation promoted a Malay supremacy ideology. At the time, Malays comprised only about 15% of Singapore's population, while over three-quarters were Chinese, with a small Indian minority. This highly diverse racial makeup, combined with Malaysia's prevailing ideology, led to severe racial tensions within Singapore. In 1964, a large-scale riot broke out between Chinese and Malays, resulting in over 3,000 arrests. These issues placed Singapore in a very awkward position from the moment it joined Malaysia. Political friction with the Malaysian central government was constant. The then Prime Minister of Malaysia and its founding father grew deeply concerned that Chinese-majority Singapore would disrupt Malaysia's political environment, viewing it as a potential thorn in their side. He moved quickly to amend the constitution, and in 1965, a vote of 126-0 expelled Singapore from Malaysia. Think about it. Usually, nations fight to expand their territory, or small regions within a country clamour for independence. But here, Malaysia was eager to push Singapore out. That's a telling indicator of how unwelcome Singapore was at the time. In a famous televised interview from that period, Lee Kuan Yew broke down in tears before the cameras and numerous media outlets. He said, "You see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysia, in merger, and the unity of these two territories." The immense blow he suffered was palpable in his eyes. The merger he had painstakingly worked to achieve was undone in less than 2 years. At this juncture, Singapore was desperately poor in natural resources, plagued by high crime rates, a severe drug problem, high unemployment, and constant labour strikes. The most intractable issue was racial conflict, with frequent clashes. Whether Chinese, Malay, or Indian, few felt a true sense of belonging. It was as if the worst performing class in school had been collectively expelled and left to fend for itself on the streets, with Lee Kuan Yew as its beleaguered class teacher. So, all this backstory, all this scene setting, it's merely the appetizer. Think of it as the introductory cutscene before a video game begins. I had to lay out just how dire the protagonist's situation was, how desperate his circumstances. On August 9, 1965, Singapore declared independence. The game had truly begun. Lee Kuan Yew's protagonist Halo was officially activated. The path he led Singapore on was, one could say, a uniquely maverick one, which ultimately proved beneficial not just for Singapore but as a model for other nations, catapulting it into the ranks of the world's most developed countries. Why maverick? Because he didn't play by the established rules. It's like in martial arts novels. Established schools like Shaolin or Wudang have their orthodox techniques. But Singapore was different. One moment it might employ a Shaolin Dragon Claw, the next a Wudang Palm. Then suddenly, some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would appear, and wham, the opponent was on the mat. His methods were unorthodox, but they were undeniably effective. He always managed to find a way to overcome challenges. That's why many find it difficult to categorize Singapore's economic policy as strictly capitalist, socialist, or any other ism. People simply refer to Lee Kuan Yew's approach as pragmatism. Whatever works, goes. Of course, this is a very general and perhaps overly simplistic summary. But I feel that if you view the various policies we are about to discuss through this lens of pragmatism, you might begin to discern the underlying logic behind his often very bold decisions. Lee Kuan Yew's blueprint for nation building. Let's look at what he specifically did. Lee Kuan Yew's mission was lift Singapore out of the mire. His thinking was also exceptionally lucid, at least as I've summarized it. 1. Stabilize the situation. Internal chaos from racial conflict and political turmoil would be unbearable. This was the primary problem to solve. 2. Build infrastructure, essential for a nation's foundation. Basic needs like water, which Singapore imported from Malaysia, and housing for its largely homeless population had to be met. 3. Find a niche. For a small nation, rapid development couldn't rely on domestic demand. Singapore needed to cooperate globally and identify its core competitiveness in international trade. 4. Attract investment. Having a competitive edge isn't enough. You need to market it to attract foreign capital and partnerships. These steps weren't necessarily sequential, many were pursued simultaneously. But this logical breakdown helps in understanding the strategy. Step 1. Stabilizing the nation. When Singapore was ejected from Malaysia, its very security, let alone development, was precarious. Lee Kuan Yew had little choice but to turn to the British again, essentially asking them to delay their departure. His aim wasn't continued colonization, but an objective assessment revealed Singapore's heavy reliance on the British military presence. Britain had 30,000 to 50,000 naval personnel stationed there. This force not only provided military protection, but also significantly contributed to the local economy through their living expenses. It's estimated this demand drove about 1/5 of Singapore's GDP. This explains why, even then, Singapore wasn't poor compared to other Southeast Asian nations. Its per capita GDP of $516 was much higher than Malaysia's. Naturally, Lee Kuan Yew didn't want the British to withdraw hastily. Using both persuasion and perhaps a veiled threat hinting at leaving the Stirling area if they left too soon, impacting trade through the vital port, he convinced the British to stay for another 3 to 4 years. Their withdrawal began in 1971. Singapore also secured a £50 million loan from Britain, ensuring military and economic stability during its vulnerable early years of independence. However, the most challenging aspect of stabilization wasn't military. It was the deeply entrenched issue of racial diversity. With recent large-scale conflict between Malays and Chinese, tensions were explosive. Upon Singapore's founding, Lee Kuan Yew emphatically declared, "Singapore is not a Malay nation, not a Chinese nation, and not an Indian nation. Everyone will find a place in Singapore. Essentially, we are all Singaporeans. Let's live together peacefully." Of course, slogans alone weren't sufficient. Lee Kuan Yew implemented a series of policies to promote racial integration. The simplest, most direct, and most immediately effective one was mandating that everyone must speak English, regardless of whether one's native tongue was Malay, Mandarin, Hokkien, or Tamil. Even if one barely knew the alphabet, the new rule was English for all. A nation, he believed, needed a unifying common language. Singapore made English an official language, and most schools were compelled to adopt it as the medium of instruction. The benefits were clear. Different ethnic groups, previously hindered by language barriers, could now communicate, fostering better understanding and interaction. Moreover, English proficiency facilitated smoother integration into the international community, a highly practical advantage. Current data reflects this shift. By first language, 48% of Singaporeans now consider English their mother tongue, while 30% still identify Mandarin as their primary language. An age-based breakdown is even more telling. Among those over 85, only 12% have English as their first language, 27% speak Hokkien. In stark contrast, among children aged 5 to 9, 75% speak English at home, and virtually none have Hokkien as their first language. This somewhat forced adoption of English led to the fascinating linguistic phenomenon of Singlish. It's a unique Creole that blends English with elements of Chinese dialects like Hokkien and Cantonese and Malay. You might hear phrases like, "Who asked you to tell him off? His house will be ready in 2 weeks, sir. He asked for 2 weeks. I give him 2 weeks law." To an unaccustomed ear, it might sound like broken English, or perhaps not even English at all. but upon closer listening, a distinct grammatical system emerges. For Mandarin speakers, Singlish often feels familiar due to its use of sentence final particles like law, and me. Okay becomes okay law, let's go becomes let's go law, and I'm busy law. Its grammar is also very direct, eschewing the elaborate polite preambles common in American English for a more straightforward approach. An American might struggle to understand Singlish, but for someone with a background in Chinese languages, it's often surprisingly easy to grasp. Returning to the English language policy, in the long run, it has had a profound and positive impact on Singapore, both in terms of racial integration and its international standing. Beyond language, Lee Kuan Yew also implemented strict racial quotas in schools, workplaces, and government-built public housing HDB flats. This meant that a certain percentage of employees in a company or residents in a housing block had to be Chinese, Malay, or Indian. The strategy was direct: mix everyone up, ensure they live and work together. If you live in the same building, work in the same company, your children attend the same primary school, and you all speak the same language, you inevitably interact. Familiarity breeds understanding, and conflicts naturally dissipate. Consequently, Singapore's demographic ratios from 1970 approximately 77% Chinese, 15% Malay, 7% Indian, 1% other have remained remarkably stable, preventing any single race from experiencing disproportionate growth. Step 2. Building a foundation, housing and infrastructure. With stability taking root, the second pillar of Lee Kuan Yew's economic strategy was to address basic needs and develop national infrastructure. Housing was the top priority. Immediately after World War II, a staggering 70% of Singapore's housing lacked sewage systems, and high-rise buildings were virtually non-existent. Even with a population of under 1 million, living conditions were extremely crowded, with high building density. Over half of Singapore could be described as slums. To tackle this housing crisis, Lee Kuan Yew's idealism came to the fore. He envisioned the government funding and constructing high-rise apartments for everyone, allowing all citizens to access quality housing at very affordable prices. His goal was home ownership for all, not just for low-income groups, but for the entire populace. This sounded incredibly ambitious, perhaps even utopian. Economists could have offered 100 reasons why it was impractical and inefficient. Yet, Lee Kuan Yew made it happen. This brings us to one of Singapore's most renowned institutional achievements, the Housing and Development Board HDB flats. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats. 80%. It's hard to imagine any other country, especially one of the world's wealthiest, where nearly the entire population resides in government-built apartments. The Singaporean government continuously acquired land and engaged in large-scale construction of multi-story apartment blocks, hence HDB flats, as they are often built in groups or blocks. To date, over 1 million modern HDB units have been constructed across the island, identifiable on maps as numerous red dots. Their architectural style is largely uniform, and estates are often interconnected by sheltered walkways, seamlessly integrated into the urban fabric, creating a distinctive Singaporean landscape. While many countries build low-cost housing for disadvantaged groups, Singapore's HDBs are different. Though not luxurious, and their architectural design might not be avant-garde, they are undeniably modern, clean residential buildings, many equipped with amenities like recreational facilities and gyms. Singaporean citizens can purchase these new HDB flats at prices 30 to 50% below the open market rate. Technically, when one buys an HDB flat, they are acquiring a 99-year lease, as the land remains government property. Consequently, flats with shorter remaining leases tend to be cheaper on the resale market. There are, of course, restrictions. Buyers must typically be Singaporean citizens, it must be their first home, and they must occupy it for a minimum period, for example, 5 years before reselling. Rules also govern subsidies and eligibility for resale flats. The overarching principle is that the government assists citizens in securing housing for living, not for speculation. Naturally, for those locals or foreigners interested in property investment, Singapore also has a private market with condominiums, villas, and landed houses. These are subject to free market dynamics without the HDB restrictions, but their prices are significantly higher, famously so. Luxury properties in central Singapore can command prices comparable to those in Hong Kong or New York. However, with 80% of the population in HDBs, public housing remains the norm. How did Singapore achieve this feat, unparalleled globally? Firstly, the government needed land. Lee Kuan Yew took a bold, even forceful, approach, enacting laws that allowed the government to acquire private land at very low prices, with little room for refusal. Secondly, the housing had to be well built, and the government needed substantial funds. Many countries could potentially manage these aspects. However, the truly critical factor, often underemphasized in analyses, was the Singaporean government's unwavering determination. This wasn't just a vague notion of confidence. Implementing the HDB system entailed enormous costs, not just financial outlays for construction, but also significant opportunity costs. The government effectively sacrificed a potentially booming private real estate market, a major economic engine in many Asian economies like China, Japan, and South Korea. To forego this cash cow in favor of universal housing security was a radical choice, one most countries and economists would deem unwise. Hong Kong, for instance, had a similar home ownership scheme, but it never reached the scale of Singapore's HDBs, largely because the allure of its lucrative private property market was too strong to significantly curtail. Traditional economic theory often suggests government intervention in housing should be limited to providing for the destitute. Singapore, however, viewed housing as a fundamental public good. Excessive commodification, they believed, would lower the quality of life, diminish happiness, and negatively impact the urban environment. So, even at the cost of a major growth engine, they pursued the HDB program with the vision of homeownership for all. This required not only defying conventional economic wisdom, but also resisting constant financial temptations while maintaining exceptional executive capacity and anti-corruption measures. This unwavering resolve was key. To curb property speculation, Singapore imposes hefty stamp duties, 20 to 30% for citizens buying second or third homes, and a staggering 60% for foreigners. The message is clear: the property market is primarily for locals, and prices should not be inflated by external speculation. Furthermore, to ensure mortgage affordability, a significant portion of every employee's income, 20%, is channeled into the Central Provident Fund (CPF), with employers contributing an additional 17%. This mandatory savings scheme is largely earmarked for housing and other basic securities. As a result, Singaporean household debt is remarkably low, under 50%, compared to figures like 73% in the US, 80% in the UK, and 95% in Hong Kong. A key reason is that Singaporeans generally don't need to incur a lifetime of debt to own a home. In essence, Singapore's housing sector is a carefully managed system, not a free market, achieving an astonishing homeownership rate of 89%. Public transport and a fine city. In Lee Kuan Yew's vision of an ideal city, the government's role extended beyond housing to encompass transportation. An extensive network of public transport, subways, MRT, light rail LRT, and buses was developed, making commuting highly convenient. However, for a small, densely populated island, unrestricted private car ownership would lead to severe congestion, aesthetic degradation, and pollution. The government deemed widespread private car ownership detrimental. Therefore, instead of a free market for cars, Singapore implemented measures to significantly increase the cost of owning one. The most notable is the Certificate of Entitlement Co. This certificate, required to register and drive a car, is issued in limited quotas based on the government's desired vehicle density. Unlike lotteries, COS are obtained through bidding. The highest bidder wins. Recently, a car could cost around $100,000, approximately $74,000 US, and it's valid for only 10 years. Combined with other taxes and duties, owning a Tesla Model 3 in Singapore could cost around $150,000 US, enough to buy several in the US or China. This deters casual car ownership, encouraging public transport use. The government achieves vehicle control and generates substantial revenue, over $6 billion annually from this system. Whether in housing or transport, Singapore champions a big government approach, providing public welfare. This meticulous planning is why Singapore, despite having the world's third highest population density, boasts a beautiful cityscape and high green coverage. It comes at a cost, borne by both government and citizens. A positive externality of this system, particularly widespread HDB living and public transport use, is a reduction in conspicuous consumption and social stratification based on these assets. Of course, private housing and cars are available, but at a very significant premium. Singapore is also famously clean. This isn't accidental. Since 1968, Keep Singapore Clean campaigns have been a constant, alongside tree planting, clean water, and even clean toilet initiatives. However, the most potent tool has arguably been strict fines that cultivate compliant habits. The ban on chewing gum since 1992 to avoid the high cost of cleaning discarded gum is well known, with penalties for illicit import. Littering, smoking in prohibited areas, or spitting can incur fines from $1,000 for a first offence up to $5,000 for a third. Even seemingly minor infractions like feeding pigeons, using a neighbour's unsecured Wi-Fi, or appearing nude in one's own home if visible to the public can lead to penalties. This rigorous enforcement, often dubbed a fine city approach, has contributed to its garden city reputation. Psychologically, according to the broken windows theory, a cleaner environment encourages people to maintain it, reducing the long-term reliance on heavy fines alone. Step 3. Investing in human capital. With stability and infrastructure in place, the next crucial element was developing Singapore's core competitiveness. Lee Kuan Yew famously stated, "First, we must invest in our only natural resource, our people." This wasn't just rhetoric. Knowing Singapore lacked physical resources and land, he understood that national advancement depended on elevating the educational standards of the entire population and cultivating talent. The Singaporean government has consistently invested heavily in education, dedicating over 20% of its annual budget to this sector. Beyond funding, a unique educational model called streaming was implemented in secondary schools from 1981. This was a response to findings in the 1970s that about a third of students were dropping out due to academic difficulty. From primary school, students underwent exams and IQ tests and were then channeled into different streams based on ability: express, normal academic, and normal technical. Each stream had a distinct curriculum and pace. The pragmatic benefit was the ability to cater instruction to different learning capabilities. Faster learners tackled more challenging material at an accelerated pace, while others received simpler content, a slower pace, and sometimes an extra year of schooling. This approach yielded immediate and impressive results. Singapore's education system gained global renown, with institutions like the National University of Singapore NUS and Nanyang Technological University NTU consistently ranking among Asia's top universities. However, the streaming system also had significant downsides. Students faced immense pressure from a young age due to constant competition and ranking, being graded and labelled from primary school onwards essentially Level 1, Level 2, etc. Despite more neutral official naming created considerable stress and potential social issues. Recognizing these drawbacks, Singapore began phasing out streaming in 2020, transitioning to a model called Full Subject-Based Banding Full SBB. This allows students to take subjects at different levels based on their aptitude in each specific area, for example, advanced math, standard chemistry. Regardless of the methods, the outcomes of Singapore's focus on education have been undeniably successful. It not only enhanced the skills of its local population, but also attracted a large pool of international talent, many of whom stay on to work after completing their studies. Complementing education was a strong emphasis on diligence and hard work. An old Singaporean productivity slogan, "Good, better, best, never let it rest," encapsulated this ethos. Lee Kuan Yew himself was a model of diligence, and this gradually permeated the national culture, fostering a strong work ethic. These high-quality, hard-working individuals became the enduring engine of Singapore's economy. In 2018, the World Bank introduced the Human Capital Index (HCI), measuring the probability that a newborn will achieve good health and education by age 18. Singapore ranked first globally with a score of 0.8, an 88% probability. laying the foundation for success. So, Lee Kuan Yew, with his protagonist Halo seemingly fully activated, employed these often unorthodox but highly effective strategies. He secured stability, built essential infrastructure, and cultivated human capital. These three cards laid the most solid foundation for Singapore's economy. With these foundational elements firmly in hand, Singapore was poised to play its ultimate ace, forming a royal flush that would propel its economy to unprecedented heights.